She walked toward this dog every soldier refused to touch. No vest, no command baton, no backup. Rex, 110 pounds of trauma-wired military muscle, had already sent 2 handlers to the emergency room that week. His file read, "Unstable, unpredictable, recommend euthanasia." And yet Emily Carter crouched down in the dirt, ignored the shouting around her, and held out her hand. Colonel Grayson smirked. His men started laughing. Then the dog stopped growling. Then the dog lowered his head. Then the entire unit went completely silent. Grayson's smile disappeared so fast, it looked like someone had cut it off his face. And that was the moment he decided to destroy her. If this story gets under your skin the way it got under mine, follow along, hit like, and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The call came in at 6:47 on a Tuesday morning, before Emily had finished her first coffee. She was already in scrubs, already halfway through a wound packing kit she'd been restocking since the night shift handed over, when the charge nurse stuck her head around the supply room door and said, "They're here." Emily didn't look up. "Which bay?" "Outside. Parking lot B." Pause. "All of them." That got her attention. She found out later that the formal arrangement between Summit Regional Medical Center and the Blackstone City Army Garrison had been in place for 3 weeks before anyone told the nursing staff. Some administrative handshake between the hospital director and a colonel she'd never met, designed to generate good press for both institutions. The program was called K9 Recovery Integration, military working dogs receiving supplemental rehabilitation alongside the trauma unit's existing animal therapy work. On paper, it looked compassionate. In practice, it meant 12 soldiers in full utility uniforms standing in the hospital parking lot at 7 in the morning, looking at the medical staff the way people look at something they're not sure is a joke. Emily pulled on a jacket over her scrubs and walked out into the cold. There were 6 dogs, all shepherds or Belgian Malinois, all muscled and alert, all watching everything at once with the particular intensity that combat-trained animals carry even when they're standing still. 3 of the handlers were visibly comfortable, loose posture, natural hand positions near the leads. The other 3 looked like they were managing something they'd rather not be managing. A man in his mid-50s stood separate from the group, arms folded, wearing the kind of expression that had probably made junior officers reconsider their life choices on a regular basis. His uniform was pressed to a degree that felt aggressive. Colonel Marcus Grayson. His aide had emailed her supervisor a 4-page briefing document the week before, which Emily had read twice because it contained almost no useful clinical information and a striking amount of language about optimal performance outcomes. "You're the volunteer nursing lead?" he said. Not a greeting. An audit. "Emily Carter." She offered her hand. He shook it once, brief, and looked past her at the hospital entrance. "We have 6 working dogs in various stages of post-deployment recovery," he said. "The program director assured me your unit had relevant experience." "Oh, we have experience with trauma recovery and behavioral rehabilitation," Emily said. "The principles translate." "These aren't pets." "I know." He looked at her for the first time, properly. Took in the scrubs, the lack of insignia, the coffee she was still holding. Whatever calculation he ran, she could see it finishing in a conclusion that didn't rate her highly. "My handlers will maintain primary control at all times. Your role is supplemental, observational." "Understood. We won't be needing emotional support techniques or," he gestured vaguely, "whatever civilian approaches you use." Emily nodded once and said nothing, which seemed to irritate him more than an argument would have. But the first week moved the way new programs always move, full of small jurisdictional tensions nobody wanted to name out loud. The soldiers watched the nursing staff the way a group of people watch someone handle something they're convinced the other person is going to drop. The nurses responded by being aggressively professional and pretending not to notice. Emily worked with 3 of the 6 dogs, a shepherd named Bravo recovering from a leg injury, a Malinois called Kira, who'd been through a vehicle explosion and startled at any sudden sound, and a 3rd dog the handlers referred to simply as the problem. His designation was Rex. Full file name, Military Working Dog T47, Rex. He'd served 2 overseas tours in explosive detection, logged more than 400 operational hours, and had been decorated twice. 8 months ago, something had happened downrange that nobody in his file wanted to describe directly. The language shifted around it, used words like incident and handler transition and behavioral regression. What the file actually showed, when you read between the euphemisms, was a dog who had watched his handler die, been transferred 3 times in 60 days, and was now responding to any kind of pressure or restraint with a violence that had sent 2 people to the ER. He was kept separate from the other dogs. His crate was in a sectioned-off area of the parking lot annex, and there was a yellow caution marker on his kennel door that Emily suspected had been there long enough to be considered permanent. She asked to see him on day 3. The handler assigned to Rex, a young specialist named Torres, who had the tight-jawed look of someone who'd been given a job he didn't choose, glanced at her ID badge and said, "You're the nurse?" "Yeah. He's not suitable for the program. He's basically just waiting on a review." "What kind of review?" Torres looked at the kennel, then back at her. "The kind where they decide whether he goes to a rescue organization or gets euthanized." Emily said, "Can I see him?" Rex heard her before he could see her. She could tell because his body orientation shifted toward the end of the crate a few seconds before she came around the partition. He was lying down, which was unusual for a stressed dog, and she realized after a moment that it wasn't calm. It was exhaustion. There's a difference, and she recognized it the way you recognize something you've seen too many times in too many different places. He looked at her. She looked at him. She didn't move toward the crate. Torres was hovering at her shoulder. "You don't want to get too close. Can you give me a minute?" A pause. "Ma'am, I don't think I'll stay outside the crate. Just give me a minute." Torres stepped back, unhappy about it. Emily sat down on the concrete floor of the parking lot annex, 4 feet from Rex's kennel, and said nothing. She'd put her coffee down somewhere. She wasn't holding anything. She let her hands rest open on her knees and watched the dog without staring at him directly, the way you watch something you're not trying to catch. Rex watched her back. His breathing was shallow. There was a scar along his left shoulder that hadn't been properly managed. The fur had grown back patchy, and the skin around it had a tightness that probably ached in cold weather. His eyes were amber, very clear, very tired. After about 4 minutes, he put his chin down on the floor of the crate. It wasn't trust. It wasn't even the beginning of trust. But it was something. A tiny withdrawal of the constant voltage he'd been running on. And Emily noted it the way she noted clinical signs, carefully and without making too much of it. She came back the next day, and the day after that. She hadn't told anyone about her service record. It wasn't a decision she'd made dramatically. It just hadn't come up, and she hadn't volunteered it. Her file at Summit Regional listed her previous employment as federal contractor, medical services, and before that, U.S. Army, 7 years, honorable discharge. She was 31 now. She'd been out for 2 years. She'd taken the ER nursing job because she needed to be around people who were trying to fix things, and because the alternative had been sitting in her apartment reading her own DD-214 and finding it insufficient company. She hadn't expected the dog program to feel like being handed a loose thread that led somewhere she'd almost forgotten. The thing about working with military dogs downrange was that you couldn't use the same tools you used on the forward operating base with a comfortable mat and a treat pouch. You were in the field, the dog was stressed, the environment was loud and unpredictable, and the relationship had to be built on something that wasn't contingent on conditions being good. She'd learned that from a handler named Sergeant Wes Morrison, who told her once that a dog in real trouble doesn't need your authority, it needs your steadiness. "Be the thing that doesn't change," he'd said. "That's the whole job." She thought about that in the parking lot annex, sitting on concrete in the cold, waiting for a dog who had every reason not to believe in human steadiness anymore. It was Grayson who set up what happened on the Thursday of the second week. She hadn't done anything to invite it. She'd simply been doing her sessions with Rex, quiet and consistent, and at some point Torres had mentioned it to another handler, who had mentioned it to someone further up, and at some point it reached Grayson. She didn't know what version of events traveled through that chain, but she suspected it gained something in translation, because when she arrived at the annex on Thursday morning, there were 8 soldiers gathered around Rex's crate area, and Grayson was standing in the center of them with his arms folded and his face wearing the particular arrangement that administrators use when they're about to demonstrate a point. "Nurse Carter," his voice carried, "I'm told you've been making progress with T-47. She looked at the crowd, looked at him. Something shifted in her chest, a recognition. She'd been in rooms like this before, just different rooms, different people. "Some," she said. "We'd like to observe today's session." She looked at Rex's crate. He was already awake, already watching the crowd with his body set in that coiled way that meant he was running at maximum tension. 8 people around his space. The smells and the noise and the energy. She could see it working on him. "This isn't a good environment for—" "The program is military-sponsored," Grayson said. "We have every right to observe." She thought about pushing back and decided it wouldn't accomplish what she needed. She walked to Rex's crate, and the crowd shifted to watch her, and someone made a low comment that got a quiet laugh. She ignored it. She crouched down 3 feet from the crate, put her hands open on her knees, and waited. Rex looked at the crowd. His ears were flat. She said his name, very quietly. Not a command, just a word, the way you'd say someone's name to tell them you're still there. Rex looked at her. Behind her, she could feel the crowd's attention shift. The difference between watching someone fail and watching something happen that wasn't in the script. She sat in the cold for 2 minutes. Grayson said something at normal volume about methodology, which broke her concentration but not her stillness. She let his voice pass through without reacting. She kept her eyes just past Rex's right ear and breathed slowly and waited. Rex put his nose against the crate door. It was a minimal thing, barely a gesture. But Torres, standing off to her right, made a small sound, something involuntary, and she heard it. She reached up and unlatched the crate door. Grayson said sharply, "What are you doing?" She didn't answer. She opened the crate slowly, not pulling, just allowing. She sat back on her heels and waited. Rex stood up inside the crate. He looked at the crowd. His body was still loaded with tension. She could see it in the set of his shoulders. But he stepped out of the crate and he stood beside her, and she didn't grab his collar or try to command him. She just stayed still and let him figure out where he was. He was trembling slightly. That was fine. After a moment, he put his nose against her shoulder. The crowd was completely quiet. She heard someone shift their weight. She heard very distantly a vehicle moving somewhere on the other side of the building. She didn't hear anyone laughing. She slowly raised her hand and rested it against Rex's neck. He didn't move. She looked up and found Grayson. He was watching her with an expression she didn't entirely understand. Not chagrin, not embarrassment, something that sat below those and was considerably less comfortable. His arms were still folded. His jaw was set. "That's not a trained response," he said. His voice was measured. "That's not a method. That's luck." Nobody said anything. "Get the dog back in his crate," he told Torres. Emily stood up. "He just responded to—" "He needs structured reintegration," Grayson said, and now his voice had the quality of a door closing. "Not coddling. This program does not endorse methods that are untested and anecdotal." He looked at the gathered soldiers. "Clear the area. Training resumes at 0900. People moved. The moment dissolved. Torres came forward with the lead, and Rex, who had been standing still beside Emily for nearly 4 minutes, felt the handler's energy the moment he was within a foot, and his head went up and his body went rigid, and by the time Torres had the lead attached, Rex was back to his baseline state of controlled aggression, pulling against the restraint. Emily watched them guide him back into the crate. Grayson pulled her into a side office that afternoon, with a lieutenant named Harwick present as witness, and a printed copy of the program protocols on the desk between them. "You opened an unsecured military working dog's kennel without authorization," he said. "I'm the volunteer program lead. The dogs are under the joint program." "The dogs are under military jurisdiction. The joint program covers observation and supplemental care. You exceeded your authority." Emily sat across from him and thought about the best argument she could make. He responded positively. "If the goal is rehabilitation, the goal is operational readiness," Grayson said, "not making a dangerous animal feel comfortable. Those aren't opposite things." Something crossed his face. "Your background," he said, looking at a file in front of him. 7 years Army, medical services, contractor work, no listed combat experience, no handler credentials. He looked up. You have no documented qualification to work with military working dogs. She was aware that the room was waiting for her to offer something, to explain herself, to fill in the silence with information. She stayed quiet. I'm restricting your access to T-47, he said, effective immediately. You can continue with Bravo and Kira under direct handler supervision. Rex doesn't have anyone else working with him. Rex is under review. The review that might end with him being euthanized. That is not your decision. He stood, which was a signal. Do you understand the terms of the restriction? Emily looked at him. She knew what was in her service record. She knew that if she walked out of this room without saying anything, he would continue to believe what he'd already decided about her, and that wasn't going to change. She also knew from 7 years of experience in environments where hierarchy was the only currency that mattered, that telling Grayson what she was wouldn't do anything except give him new material to work with. She stood up and said, "Understood." Torres caught her in the hallway outside the annex 2 days later. He's not eating, Torres said. He had the look of someone who had decided to say something they'd been deciding about for a while. Rex, since yesterday, they switched handlers, Sergeant Bowman's taking over, and he won't eat, and he's been up all night. Emily said, "Has anyone called the vet?" The vet said it's behavioral. It is behavioral. I know. Torres stopped walking. I know, I thought you should know. She went back to her shift, took a patient's blood pressure, talked to panicking family through a diagnosis, changed IV lines, and thought about a dog who had learned the hard way that people leave. That night she stayed 2 hours past the end of her shift, sitting in her car in the hospital parking lot, watching the lights in the administrative offices and thinking about the 7 years she'd spent learning how to be useful in situations where the rules about what was useful were written by people who'd never been in the situation. She thought about what Morrison had told her. Be the thing that doesn't change. She thought about the fact that she hadn't pushed back when Grayson read his list of her credentials. Hadn't told him that 2 of those overseas contractor years involved 12-hour rotations treating both human casualties and injured military working dogs in forward surgical environments. Hadn't mentioned the additional handler certification she'd completed during her 5th year. Hadn't said a single word about the 6 dogs she'd helped rehabilitate during her last deployment, 2 of which had returned to active duty within 90 days. She hadn't said any of it because it wouldn't have mattered. Not yet. Bah. The call came in on a Friday morning at 8:22, and Emily heard it first through the hospital PA system before the specific information reached the nursing station. All non-essential personnel to secure indoor locations. This is not a drill. She was changing a dressing on a patient in Bay 4 when the intercom activated. She finished the dressing, tucked the edge of the bandage, told the patient to stay where he was, and walked to the station. "What is it?" she asked the charge nurse. The charge nurse had her phone in her hand, and her face was wrong in a way that moved Emily's assessment immediately into a higher category. "Bomb threat," she said quietly. "One of the service elevators. Maintenance found a package." Package meaning they've called the garrison. Military K-9 teams are responding. She looked at the phone again. The bomb squad won't go in without a sweep first. Emily looked down the hallway. Through the window at the far end, she could see the parking lot, and she could see figures moving. Military uniforms, organized but fast. The kind of movement that had a timeline attached to it. How many patients in non-ambulatory wards? 37 in this wing. Another 22 in the surgical recovery. The math was simple and very bad. She watched the parking lot and thought about 6 dogs, 3 of whom were operational and 3 of whom were not. And she thought about Rex in his crate, running on no sleep and no food, and whatever was left of whatever had kept him going through everything else. She thought about a bomb squad waiting on a sweep, and a dog who had 400 operational hours in explosive detection, and a building full of people who couldn't move themselves to safety. She was still watching the parking lot when she saw the first K-9 team move toward the building entrance, and then stop. And she could tell from the handler's posture and the dog's response that something was already wrong. The radio at the nursing station crackled, and a voice she didn't know said, "First team couldn't clear the elevator lobby. Dog's not confirming." A different voice. Second team in position? Static. Then, second team is negative. Handlers reporting the dog is refusing to enter the space. Emily put down the roll of surgical tape she'd been holding. Somewhere outside in the parking lot annex, in a crate with a caution marker on its door, was a dog with 400 hours of the exact experience this building currently needed. She had been restricted from T-47's area by Grayson's order. She picked up her ID badge from the counter, looked at it for a moment, and then walked toward the door. The door to the annex was propped open with a cinder block, the way it always was when the handlers were moving equipment, and Emily went through it without slowing down. The parking lot outside the annex was a controlled mess. 2 military vehicles parked at angles that suggested they'd arrived fast, a cluster of soldiers near the building's east entrance, radios going, someone on a phone with their back turned. Nobody was watching the annex. She went straight to Rex's crate. He heard her before she came around the partition. She knew because his posture changed. Not relaxed, not yet, but the particular quality of his alertness shifted from the generalized vigilance of a stressed animal to something more directed, more specific. When she came around the corner and he saw her, his ears moved, just slightly, just enough. "Hey," she said quietly. She didn't stop walking, didn't crouch, just came to the crate and sat down beside it the way she'd been doing for 2 weeks. "I know, it's loud." It was loud. The radios, the vehicles, the sound of boots on concrete, voices carrying from the far side of the building. All of it was feeding into the annex, and Rex was running on empty, and the combination should have had him at the back of the crate in maximum defensive posture. Instead, he came to the front of the crate and put his nose through the wire. She didn't touch him yet. She let him take her scent, let him do the processing he needed to do, and she sat with her back against the crate and looked at the ceiling and thought about what she was doing. Grayson's restriction was still in effect. She was in direct violation of a written order from the program's military commanding officer. If this went wrong, if she took Rex out of that crate and he bit someone, or failed to locate anything, or panicked in the building, there was no version of events in which she came out of it with her position intact, probably not with her nursing license intact. She thought about 37 patients in non-ambulatory wards. She unlatched the crate. Charged. Getting Rex out was not the problem. Rex came out of the crate carefully, sniffed the ground, and pressed against her left leg with the unconscious certainty of an animal who had decided she was a fixed point. The problem was the lead. His lead, a standard military working dog leash, was hanging on the hook beside his crate, and when she reached for it, Rex's body went rigid. Not aggressive, not yet, but the memory was there, the thing the lead meant, the kind of handling that came after it. She left the lead on the hook. She knew what she was doing was outside of procedure. She also knew she'd worked with off-leash dogs in forward environments when circumstances didn't allow for the alternative, and that Rex had enough operational training in his muscle memory that if she gave him the right signals, he would work with her. She was banking on that. She was banking on a lot of things right now. "Come on," she said, and walked toward the annex door, and Rex fell into position at her left heel like he'd been trained to do it, because he had been trained to do it, 400 hours worth. She came out of the annex into the organized chaos of the parking lot, and someone saw her immediately. "Hey," a specialist she didn't know. "You can't have that dog out here. Is that T-47? "Where's the incident commander?" she said without stopping. "Ma'am, the incident commander. Where?" He pointed, and she walked. Dot. The incident commander was a captain named Delgado, mid-30s, with the kind of focused exhaustion on his face that meant he'd been dealing with something going wrong for long enough that he'd accepted it and was now working the problem. He saw her coming and saw Rex, and his expression did something complicated. "You're the nurse. Carter. Where are the 2 teams that couldn't clear?" "East lobby, elevator bank, but what happened?" He looked at Rex, looked at her. Bravo went to threshold and refused entry. Kira entered and hit on a false location. "We've got the EOD team sitting on a spot that's clean. We're running out of time." He checked his radio. "The package was found 30 minutes ago. We have a window of about 15 before we start mandatory evacuation, and we've got patients who can't be moved safely. I need access to the East lobby. T-47 is restricted." T-47 has 400 hours of explosive detection. He's also been flagged as operationally unfit. By who? A pause. Delgado looked at Rex, who was sitting at Emily's left heel, ears forward, reading the environment with the calm focus of a dog who had finally woken up to something familiar. Not the parking lot chaos, not the hospital annex, the smell of a working situation, the thing his whole body had been built and trained for. Colonel Grayson filed the operational assessment, Delgado said. Is Colonel Grayson here? Another pause. No. Then let me do my job. Delgado made a decision. She could see it happening, the weighing of risks, the calculation of which mistake he could live with, and she stood still and let him make it without pushing, because the worst thing she could do right now was make him feel cornered. You go in with Sergeant Okafor, he said. She stays with you. You don't enter a secondary space without her. Anything goes wrong with the dog, you pull back? Understood. And Carter? He caught her eye. If this goes sideways, I can't protect you from the report. I know, she said. Sergeant Maya Okafor was compact. 30, maybe. With a close-cut head and a way of moving that suggested she'd been in more complicated situations than this one and had come out the other side. She looked at Rex for about 4 seconds when they were introduced, taking in the dog's posture, his responsiveness to Emily's position, the fact that he was off lead. He's working off leash, she said. He's reactive to restraint, and you're comfortable with that. I've done it before. Okafor looked at her with the same expression Torres had used in the beginning, the calculation, the skepticism, but she nodded and said, East lobby, let's go. They went in through a side entrance, past a security desk that had been vacated, into the tiled corridor that led to the elevator bank. The hospital had gone very quiet in the way buildings go quiet, when the people in them know something is wrong and are waiting to find out how wrong. Emily could hear ventilation systems, the distant sound of monitors from closed ward doors, someone's radio 3 floors up. Rex was alert without being reactive. He moved beside her with his nose working, reading the corridor, the surfaces, the air current from the elevator shaft, and she let him set the pace, which was what you did with a good detection dog. You didn't lead them, you followed their nose. The package is supposed to be in the elevator mechanical room, Okafor said quietly. Second-level sub-basement. Bravo refused at the stairwell door. Was the stairwell propped? No. Emily thought about that. A dog refusing at a closed door wasn't always failure. Sometimes it was a dog telling you something about the other side of the door. Bravo might have been right. EOD can't go in on a maybe. I know. They reached the stairwell door. Rex stopped before they did. Not in refusal, but in the focused, still attention that meant his nose had found something to process. His body went into the working posture, weight slightly forward, tail lowered, and quiet. Emily watched him and felt something shift in her chest. Not relief, not yet, but recognition. She looked at Okafor and said nothing. Okafor looked at Rex and said nothing. They both knew what they were watching. Rex moved to the door, sniffed the gap at the base, and sat. The sit was the trained alert. It meant, here. Stairwell, Emily said. Okafor was already on her radio. EOD swept the stairwell in 11 minutes. They found the package on the landing between Subbasement 1 and Subbasement 2, a briefcase-sized device that the EOD team leader described later, in the debrief, as viable and constructed with knowledge. Not a prank. Not a crude improvisation. Something built by someone who knew what they were doing, positioned in a location that would have maximized structural damage to the elevator shaft and the utility systems running alongside it. They cleared it in another 8 minutes. Emily heard the all clear through Okafor's radio and sat down on the floor of the east lobby because her legs had decided they were done standing for a moment. Rex came and sat beside her, pressed against her right side, and she put her hand on his back and felt him breathing. Good boy, she said, which was inadequate for what had just happened, but it was what she had. Okafor crouched down across from her, radio in her hand, expression unreadable. Where did you work before Summit Regional? Emily looked at her. Medical contractor, 7 years Army before that. Medical only? She considered the question and what was behind it. I was forward surgical for 3 years. After that, I got cross-attached to a K-9 unit during a deployment. Extended. Came back, did another rotation, same unit. Handler certified? Year 5. Okafor sat with that for a moment. So when Grayson read your file and said no combat experience, no handler credentials, he read the civilian summary, and you didn't correct him. No. Okafor looked at Rex, who was leaning into Emily's side with the comfortable weight of an animal who had just done something he was built for and was now simply existing. Why not? Emily thought about the honest answer. Because it wouldn't have changed anything, she said. Not from him. Not at that point. Okafor stood up. Her face had gone through something in the last 4 minutes and come out the other side with a different expression on it, one that looked more like respect than anything Emily had seen since arriving at Summit Regional. You should have led with it. Maybe. It would have saved a lot of time. Probably, Emily said, but that's not usually how it works, is it? Okafor didn't answer that, which was its own kind of answer. Also, what happened in the next 2 hours felt, in retrospect, like watching water find cracks in a foundation. You couldn't see the structural damage until it was already done. The events themselves were mundane. A debrief in the security office, forms, statements, Delgado on the phone with someone above him while Emily answered Okafor's questions and tried to figure out what she was supposed to do with Rex, who needed water and food in a quieter environment than the security office. Torres appeared at some point, looking like he'd run from the annex, and he took Rex's lead, which Emily had finally attached, carefully, with Rex watching her face the whole time to gauge if he should accept it, and said quietly, I heard what happened. Is there water back in the annex? Yeah, I'll take him. Torres paused. Is he okay? He's tired, Emily said. Let him rest. Don't change his environment again tonight. Torres nodded and took Rex, and the dog went with him without pulling, which was not what would have happened 3 hours ago, and both of them knew it. Delgado found her when Rex was gone, and Torres was back in the annex, and the security office had cleared out slightly. The garrison commander is being briefed, he said. Colonel Grayson has been notified. Something in his tone made her look at him carefully. Notified of what, specifically? The incident. Your involvement. T-47's performance. He paused. The fact that T-47 was under an operational restriction that Grayson filed. That restriction was based on his assessment of the dog. Yes, Delgado said, and the dog just cleared an active bomb threat that 2 other certified teams couldn't handle. He looked at her. Grayson is going to call this a chain of command violation. He's going to make it about your unauthorized access to a restricted animal. I know. The garrison commander may agree with him. I know that too. Delgado rubbed the back of his neck. I'm going to be honest with you. I supported your access today because I was out of options, but I work in this command structure. There are limits to what I can say in a formal debrief. I'm not asking you to say anything that isn't true. I know. He looked at the door. I'm telling you that the chain of command has ways of making things true-ish that benefit the chain of command. You should be prepared for that. Emily nodded. She'd been prepared for that since approximately the 2nd day of the program, when Grayson had shaken her hand like she was an inconvenience and looked past her at the hospital entrance. Grayson arrived at 1400. She was still in the security office, finishing paperwork, when she heard his voice in the corridor. That measured, carrying quality, the voice of a man accustomed to rooms orienting toward him when he spoke. She heard Delgado say something in response, quiet, and then the door opened and Grayson came in, and his face was wearing an expression she hadn't seen on him before. She'd seen him dismissive, she'd seen him condescending, she'd seen the cold administrative anger of the office confrontation. This was different. This was the face of someone who had received information that was inconvenient in a way that made them feel something they didn't want to feel, and were converting it rapidly into anger because that was a more manageable emotion. You violated a direct written order, he said, without preamble. Good afternoon, Colonel. You accessed a restricted military working dog without authorization, without a handler present, without a lead. Sergeant Okafor was present. Okafor was not the assigned handler. She had no authority to authorize your access. He had a folder in his hand that he set on the table between them. This is a formal notification of your removal from the K-9 Recovery Integration Program, effective immediately. It also initiates a review with the hospital administration regarding your conduct. Emily looked at the folder. Rex located the device. T-47 performed an uncontrolled sweep under non-standard conditions. That's not a success, it's a liability. The bomb squad cleared the device in 8 minutes, based on an uncertified sweep by a restricted animal. She looked at him and thought, with great clarity, about all the things she could say. She thought about Wes Morrison and Be the Thing That Doesn't Change. She thought about a dog who had been sleeping 3 hours ago, who had walked into a stairwell and sat down with absolute certainty and been right. She thought about the folder on the table and the review it initiated and where that review would go, and she made a decision about what order things needed to happen in. "I'll accept the notification," she said. Grayson blinked. He'd been expecting an argument, she could tell. "I'll accept it," she said. "I'd like a copy for my records." He pushed it across the table, and she picked it up, and she stood. "This isn't over," he said, and it had the quality of a warning, but also the quality of a man who felt, for reasons he probably couldn't articulate, that something had slipped sideways in a way he hadn't planned for. "No," Emily said. "It isn't." She walked out. She called Dr. Anita Vasquez from the parking lot. Vasquez was the hospital's chief medical officer. Emily had spoken to her exactly twice, briefly, in the way junior staff speak to the CMO in hallway passing. What she knew about Vasquez came from observation. She was direct, she had a background in emergency medicine, and she had the reputation of someone who made decisions based on outcomes rather than politics, which could be either good or bad depending on which way the outcomes cut. The call went to voicemail. Emily left a message that was 12 seconds long and said she needed to speak to Dr. Vasquez at her earliest convenience regarding the K-9 program and the morning's incident. Then she sat in her car for a moment. Her hands were steady, which surprised her slightly. She'd expected some kind of delayed reaction, the physical response that usually caught up with you after you'd been running on operational focus. But what she felt was mostly a particular kind of tiredness that wasn't about sleep. The tiredness of having been right about something in a room full of people who were committed to believing otherwise. She thought about Rex in the annex right now, hopefully drinking water, hopefully eating, hopefully lying down in the quiet that Torres would make sure he had, because Torres, at least, had started to pay attention. She thought about 400 operational hours, and a flagged file, and a euthanasia review, and a dog putting his nose against the gap under a stairwell door with the precision of an instrument. She thought about Grayson's folder and the review it initiated, and the fact that review would require her personnel file, and her personnel file had a civilian summary at the front that read like a mop with federal contractor and 7 years medical services and nothing else. And behind that civilian summary was a military file that told a different story. She thought about how long she'd been happy to let people read the civilian summary. Not much longer, she decided. Torres texted her at 1740. Rex ate, all of it. He's sleeping. She stared at the message for a moment and then typed back, "Good. Don't let anyone move him tonight. I won't. For what it's worth, I put it in my incident log. What he did today, all of it." She read that twice. She didn't know exactly what Torres's incident log would mean in the larger chain of events, but she knew that a specialist's contemporaneous written record had a weight that was different from a verbal account. And she knew Torres had probably understood that when he wrote it. "Thank you," she typed. "You know they're going to try to make this about you breaking protocol." "Yeah, that's not what happened." "I know," she typed. "What are you going to do?" She thought about Dr. Vasquez's voicemail. She thought about her military file sitting in a federal records system under her full service name, 500 pages long, including 2 commendations and a cross-attachment evaluation and a handler certification and the case notes from 6 rehabilitation sessions with K9S in forward environments, all of it time-stamped and corroborated and signed by officers who were still serving. She thought about Grayson standing in the security office telling her Rex's performance was a liability. "Let the record speak," she typed back. She put the phone in her pocket and got out of her car and went back into the hospital. Because she had 6 hours left on her shift and there were patients who needed things done. And that was the job. And she had always been someone who did the job. Oh, she didn't sleep that night. Not entirely. She dozed in 2-hour increments, woke, lay looking at the ceiling, went through the sequence of the morning the way she always processed operational events. Not catastrophizing, just running the tape, checking for the moments where she'd made choices and whether they'd been the right choices. The stairwell threshold, the off-lead decision, the fact that she'd taken Okafor's presence as implicit authorization rather than explicit and had banked on the emergency circumstances to cover the gap. These were all defensible. None of them were clean. The part that kept her up was simpler than tactics. It was Grayson's face in the security office. Not the anger. She'd expected the anger. It was the thing underneath the anger, the thing she'd identified in the parking lot after the training session and hadn't been able to name correctly until now. It wasn't just ego. Ego was manageable, predictable, something you could navigate around because it operated by rules. What she'd seen under Grayson's anger was something more specific. It was the look of a man for whom her being right was not an abstraction. It was a threat to something he'd been maintaining, and the maintenance of it mattered to him in a way that had nothing to do with the program or the dogs or the patients. She didn't know what that was yet. She thought she was going to find out. Dr. Vasquez called back at 7:10 the next morning while Emily was in her car in the hospital parking lot eating a granola bar she didn't taste. "Emily Carter," Vasquez said. Her voice was the same as it was in the hallway, direct, no small talk. "Tell me what happened yesterday," Emily told her. All of it, starting from the restriction order and ending with Rex's alert in the stairwell. She didn't editorialize. She gave it to her the way she'd give a handoff report. Sequential, factual, with the relevant clinical observations included, and the irrelevant ones stripped out. When she finished, there was a pause. "You have handler certification," Vasquez said. "Yes." "That's not in your hospital file." "My hospital file reflects what I disclosed at hire. I didn't disclose my full military record." "Why not?" It was the same question Okafor had asked, and Emily gave essentially the same answer. "It wasn't relevant to the nursing position. It was relevant to the K-9 program." "Yes." Another pause. Vasquez was doing the same calculation everyone did, working out the shape of the thing. "Colonel Grayson has filed a formal complaint with hospital administration citing conduct unbecoming a program participant and unauthorized animal handling." "I know." "He's also requesting that we initiate a performance review." "I know that too." "What he doesn't know," Vasquez said, "is that I received a call this morning from Captain Delgado, who gave me a verbal account of yesterday's events that is significantly different from Grayson's written report." Emily said nothing. Delgado's account includes the detail that both certified K-9 teams failed to locate the device, that T-47 located it within approximately 4 minutes of entering the East Lobby, and that the EOD team used T-47's alert as the basis for their sweep. That's accurate. Grayson's report describes T-47's performance as an uncontrolled and uncertified sweep that should not be considered operationally valid. The granola bar sat in Emily's hand, forgotten. "Dr. Vasquez," Emily said, "I'd like to submit my full military file to the hospital's records. There are things in it that are relevant to the current situation." A pause. "Yes," Vasquez said. "I think there probably are." Another pause. Shorter. "Carter, are there things in Grayson's conduct that I should know about? Things beyond yesterday?" Emily looked at the hospital entrance. She thought about Rex's operational file, the rehabilitation sabotage Torres had mentioned, the training methods reimposed after her restriction, undoing the progress, the dog's refusal to eat. She thought about the gap between Grayson's assessment of Rex and Rex's demonstrated capability. She thought about what it meant for a colonel to file an operational assessment that declared a dog unfit when the dog had 400 hours on its record and had just cleared a live threat. "I don't know enough yet to say," she said carefully, "but I think someone should look at T-47's full operational file. Not the summary, the full file." A silence on the other end. Long enough that Emily checked to see if the call had dropped. "I'll make some calls," Vasquez said, and ended it. The message from Grayson's office arrived at 10:45. sent through hospital administration, CC'd to the program director and the garrison's legal office. It notified her that pending the formal review, her access to any garrison personnel, equipment, or animals was suspended, and that any further contact with T-47 or any military working dog in the program would constitute a violation that would be referred to the appropriate authorities. She read it at the nursing station between a blood draw and a medication consult. She thought about Rex sleeping in the annex. She thought about Torres's text. She thought about the full military file she'd submitted to Vasquez's office that morning, the one with the cross-attachment evaluations and the handler cert and the K9 case notes, all of it signed and time-stamped and corroborated. She thought about a colonel who had filed an operational assessment declaring an experienced detection dog unfit, and the question she hadn't finished asking herself yet. Why? Not why Grayson disliked her, that part she understood. But why Rex specifically? Why had a dog with Rex's record ended up in an annex with a euthanasia review pending? Why had the rehabilitation attempts been shut down? Why had a colonel with Grayson's rank taken personal interest in a single dog's case? She hadn't found that thread yet. She thought she was close to it. At 2:15, Torres texted her again. "They're moving Rex." She stared at the message. Moving him where? Garrison kennels. Off-site. Grayson's order. She stood up from the nursing station so fast her chair rolled back and hit the wall. The charge nurse looked over. Emily held up one finger, turned away, typed back. When? Now. Loading him now. She looked at the suspension notice on her phone. She looked at the hallway. She thought about everything that happened when a dog with Rex's trauma history got loaded into a transport without the right preparation, moved to an unfamiliar facility, separated from the one consistent presence he'd had in the last 2 weeks. She thought about what Grayson was doing and why he was doing it now, today, within hours of the investigation inquiry that Vasquez had said she would initiate. A dog who couldn't be evaluated couldn't provide evidence of anything. A dog off-site at a garrison facility was under military jurisdiction only, outside the joint program parameters, inaccessible to the hospital's inquiry process. "Tell Delgado," she typed back. "Already did. He says he doesn't have authority to countermand Grayson's order." She was already moving toward the exit, pulling off her badge lanyard, running the calculation of exactly how many violations she was about to commit and whether any of them were worth it. And she was still running that calculation when she pushed through the door into the parking lot and saw the garrison transport vehicle idling at the far end, and the doors to the rear compartment open, and Torres standing beside it looking at his phone, and Grayson 20 feet away with his arms folded, and Rex in a transport crate on the ground beside the vehicle, his body rigid, ears flat, running on nothing but fear and the muscle memory of every bad thing that had ever happened after a transport crate. Grayson saw her coming. His chin lifted, his eyes went cold in a way that confirmed, without any further evidence needed, that moving the dog was not about the dog. She walked toward Rex anyway, and then, from the far side of the parking lot, a vehicle she didn't recognize came through the garrison entrance, unmarked, dark, military plates, and 2 people got out, and one of them had a rank on their collar that stopped Grayson's chin from staying lifted. The second person was holding a document, and even from 30 feet away, Emily could see it was not the kind of document that came from Grayson's office. Grayson looked at the vehicle and the people getting out of it, and something happened to his face that Emily hadn't seen there before. He looked uncertain. The woman who got out of the passenger side moved like someone accustomed to people getting out of her way, and they did. She was 50 or so, silver-threaded hair cut close, a colonel's eagle on her collar that she wore like it had always been there. The man beside her was younger, civilian clothes, carrying a leather satchel, and the particular expression of someone whose job involved delivering information that changed the shape of rooms. Colonel Diane Merritt. Emily didn't know her, but she watched Grayson's face recognize the name on whatever identification Merritt presented, and she watched his posture do something involuntary. A micro-adjustment, the kind of physical recalibration that happens when the power in a room shifts faster than the body can pretend it hasn't. "Colonel Grayson." Merritt's voice was conversational, not warm. "We need to talk about your K9 program." "Colonel Merritt, I wasn't informed of an inspection." "It's not an inspection." She glanced at the transport crate. at Rex inside it, at the vehicle with its doors open. Why is T-47 being transported? A beat. Operational relocation. Standard procedure for restricted animals. This morning, Merritt said it flatly. Not a question. The situation at the hospital yesterday created liability issues. No. The situation at the hospital yesterday, Merritt said, resulted in an active device being located and cleared. I've read Delgado's report. She looked at Emily. You're Carter. Yes, ma'am. Stand by. She went back to Grayson. The civilian with the satchel had opened it and was already taking notes, which was the kind of detail that tended to change the temperature of conversations without anyone saying why. Emily stood where she was and looked at Rex in his crate. He was watching her. His ears had come up slightly when she'd walked toward him. That same specific directional attention, the recognition that by now she understood was not generalized but targeted. He knew her step, probably her smell from 20 feet. She stayed still and let him read her the way she'd been letting him read her since the first day in the annex. And after a moment, he lay down inside the transport crate, and his ears relaxed marginally, and she took that as information. Behind her, Grayson was talking. His voice had modulated into the register he used when he was managing a situation. Smooth, authoritative, each sentence constructed to sound like the obvious conclusion. She caught fragments, program parameters, documented behavioral issues, chain of command decision. Merritt said something short that Emily didn't catch. Grayson's voice stopped. They moved the conversation inside, to the security office that had already absorbed a significant amount of this building's recent history. Merritt, Grayson, the civilian with the satchel whose name turned out to be Rourke, some kind of Inspector General's investigator, though nobody said so directly, and Emily, who had been told to remain available and had interpreted that as a direction to sit in the corridor outside and wait, which she did. She could hear the shape of the conversation through the door without hearing the words. Grayson's measured cadence going for longer stretches at first, then shorter. Merritt's voice sparse and flat as a surgical cut. Rourke barely audible. The particular rhythm of an interview where one person begins to understand that the questions being asked are not the questions they thought they were answering. Torres appeared at the end of the corridor, saw her, and came to sit beside her on the bench. He had a coffee she hadn't asked for, which he held out anyway, and she took it. "Did you know she was coming?" Emily said quietly. "No." Torres looked at the door. "But I know Rourke, he's IG. He's not here for the bomb incident." She looked at him. "How long has he been running something?" "I don't know, but the IG doesn't open a file from a single incident report. That takes time to build." Torres held his coffee in both hands. "Someone started talking before yesterday." She thought about that. She thought about what Vasquez had said, "I'll make some calls." And she thought about the timeline, about how fast Merritt and Rourke had appeared. And she recalculated. Not in response to yesterday. Yesterday had accelerated something already in motion. "Rex's operational file," she said. Torres looked at her. "Someone requested it. Before I did. Before any of this." She kept her voice low. "Who else has been looking at Rex's record?" Torres was quiet for long enough that she knew he had an answer and was deciding what to do with it. "There was a handler," he said finally, "last year, before I got assigned. Sergeant named Kowalski. He filed a welfare complaint about T-47's training conditions and then got transferred inside of 2 weeks. Emily set the coffee down on the bench beside her. "Where?" "Overseas rotation. Fast. The kind of fast that doesn't happen through normal channels." She looked at the door again. Kowalski's welfare complaint. Filed and buried. A handler transferred out before the complaint could gain traction. A dog's rehabilitation deliberately undermined. Not negligence, she understood now, but management. Keeping Rex non-functional kept something contained. The question was what? The door opened. Rourke came out first, looked at her and said, "Ms. Carter, we'd like your statement, full account, from the first day of the program." She stood up. "All of it?" "Everything you observed, everything T-47 was subjected to, everything Colonel Grayson said to you directly." He had a recorder in his hand, small and professional. "We'll also need your full military file, which I understand Dr. Vasquez has already received a copy of." Yes. Good. He held the door. This may take a while. Emily looked back at Torres, who gave her a small nod that meant something. She went in. It took 2 hours and 40 minutes. She told it the same way she'd told Vasquez, sequential, factual, the relevant observations included, and the editorializing stripped out. She described the first week, the training session in the parking lot, the restriction order, the office confrontation. She described Rex's behavioral presentation and what it indicated clinically, the symptoms of complex stress response in working dogs, the specific signs she'd been trained to identify, the difference between aggression and trauma that looked like aggression. She described the bomb threat, the failed sweeps, her decision to access Rex's crate. She described Grayson's face in the security office when she'd accepted his notification without argument. Merritt was present for the second hour, sitting to one side, not asking questions but listening with the focused stillness of someone building a picture. Once, when Emily described Rex's stairwell alert, Merritt made a small sound that wasn't quite a word but communicated something. When Rourke said thank you, that's sufficient, and clicked off the recorder, Emily sat for a moment in the suddenly quiet room and felt the specific exhaustion of having held a precise accounting together for 2.5 hours without letting it drift into anything she couldn't substantiate. "Ms. Carter," Merritt said, "how long did you work with military working dogs?" 2 rotations, cross-attached to a K-9 unit, combined, about 22 months active. And in that time, have you seen this pattern before? A handler or program officer managing a dog's welfare record? She thought about how to answer that carefully. I've seen animals whose condition didn't match their documented status. In both directions, animals listed as functional who weren't, and animals listed as impaired who were capable of more than their record showed. In your assessment, what is T-47's actual operational status? Yesterday's performance was consistent with a trained, experienced detection dog at near-peak function, Emily said. The behavioral issues that flagged him as restricted were consistent with treatable trauma responses, not permanent impairment. Given appropriate rehabilitation, my assessment is that he would be fully operational. Merritt looked at her for a moment. That directly contradicts Grayson's filed assessment. Yes, Emily said. It does. They released her from the security office at 1600, and she walked back out to the parking lot annex to find Rex. He was still in the transport crate. Nobody had moved him, she realized. The transport vehicle was still there, doors still open, but the order to relocate had been, somewhere in the last 3 hours, quietly suspended. Torres was sitting on a crate nearby with his phone, and when he saw her, he stood up. "They're leaving him here," he said. "I know." She crouched down by Rex's crate. He raised his head and looked at her with the amber eyes that had a quality she'd stopped trying to name because the right word for it wasn't clinical. He looked tired. She looked tired. They were even. She unlatched the crate. Rex came out slowly, stretched, shook himself once, and then walked to her and put his head against her knee with a weight that was deliberate. She put her hand on the back of his neck. Torres sat back down on the crate and looked at the distance. Rourke's team is pulling Grayson's training logs. All of them, going back 18 months. Emily kept her hand on Rex's neck. They'll find gaps. What kind of gaps? The kind where documented training hours don't align with actual animal condition. If Grayson's been managing Rex's welfare record, there will be sessions logged that didn't happen the way they're described. She thought about Rex's shoulder scar, the one that had healed badly. Probably medical notations too. An animal's injury record tells you how the injuries were treated and how fast. If the treatment was delayed or inadequate, that shows up in the tissue. Torres was quiet. Someone should pull Rex's veterinary records from the last 8 months, she said. Not the summary, the actual examination notes. I can request that. Do it through Delgado. Don't go through Grayson's office for anything right now. Torres nodded. She sat with Rex for 20 minutes, not doing anything specific, just being present in the way she'd been present since the first day, and felt him slowly stop running at the voltage of the last several hours. His breathing evened out. His weight against her knee increased as some of the held tension in his muscles released. It wasn't a dramatic transformation. It was the small physiological arithmetic of an animal returning from a sustained threat state. Marginal, measurable, real. She thought about Kowalski, transferred in 2 weeks. She thought about what Kowalski had seen that had made him file a welfare complaint, and what that complaint had cost him. She thought about Grayson's assessment of Rex, operationally unfit, recommend euthanasia review, and what it meant that a decorated detection dog had been edging toward that conclusion for 8 months, while his actual capability sat intact underneath the trauma, waiting for someone to look at it correctly. It wasn't just negligence. Negligence didn't transfer handlers in 2 weeks. Negligence didn't impose a restriction on a dog the moment someone started making progress with him. Negligence didn't move a transport vehicle into position the morning an IG investigator arrived. There was something in Rex's operational file that Grayson needed to stay buried, and Rex being declared unfit and euthanized was cleaner than Rex recovering and being evaluated by someone who knew what they were looking at. She didn't know yet what it was, but she was certain of the shape of it. Rourke found her at the annex at 17:30. He had his satchel over one shoulder and the look of someone at the end of a long day who had found more than they expected to find. He looked at Rex, at Emily's hand on the dog's neck, at the transport crate sitting empty with its door open. "We've pulled Grayson's program files," he said. "I can't share specifics of an active investigation." "I know. I can tell you that T-47's veterinary records have been requested and we're waiting on them from the base medical facility." She looked at him. "How long has the investigation been open?" He considered whether to answer. 11 weeks? 11 weeks. The program had been running for 3, which meant Grayson had been under investigation before the joint program with Summit Regional started, which meant the hospital's K-9 program had been established while Grayson was already under scrutiny. "Did he know?" she asked. "About the investigation?" Rourke looked at the wall. "We believe he became aware approximately 4 weeks ago." 4 weeks ago was the week the program started. The week Grayson had stood in the hospital parking lot and looked at the assembled nursing staff like he was auditing them. The week he'd told her his handlers would maintain primary control and her role was observational. The week he'd decided to make her the problem. He needed a distraction, she said. Not to Rourke specifically, more to the shape of it. The program, making an issue of the joint protocol, the nursing staff overstepping. If he could generate a conduct complaint inside the program, it redirects the paperwork. The IG starts looking at the civilian interface issue and not at the training logs. Rourke said nothing, which was confirmation enough. "And when I started working with Rex," she said, and Rex started responding. That was a specific threat, not just to his authority in the program. "Ms. Carter," Rourke's voice was careful, "I need you to let the investigation process run. I know. Whatever conclusions you've drawn, and I think they're probably in the right direction, they need to come from the evidence chain, not from a nurse who went outside her authorization twice in 3 days." She looked at him directly. "What happens to Rex?" A pause. "T-47 is currently a material witness to a welfare investigation. His status can't be altered pending the review." "That means he stays." "That means he stays." She nodded. "Then I'll let it run." Rourke started to turn, then stopped. "Carter. The handler who filed the welfare complaint last year. Kowalski. He's been contacted. He's willing to give a statement." She felt something loosen in her chest she hadn't known was held tight. "Good. He's been sitting on it for 11 months, Rourke said, waiting for someone to pick up the other end. He looked at Rex, something complicated in his expression. He said T-47 is the reason he filed it. He didn't want to leave without saying something. After he was gone, she sat in the annex with Rex until the light changed and the parking lot went to evening dark. And she thought about Kowalski sitting on an overseas rotation for 11 months with a complaint nobody acted on, waiting for someone to pick up the other end. She thought about the things that happen when there's no one to pick it up. Well, at 2100, her phone rang. Unknown number, military exchange. She answered it and heard a voice she didn't recognize, or older, a general's deliberate pace, each word placed with the patience of someone who didn't need to rush. "Ms. Carter, this is Brigadier General Harold Stokes. Inspector General's Office, Regional Command. A pause. I've reviewed your statement and your service file this evening. I have a few questions. But first, I want to tell you something. She waited. Sergeant Kowalski gave us everything we needed 11 months ago, Stokes said. What we didn't have was corroboration from someone with the specific expertise to assess T-47's clinical presentation and speak to the gap between his documented status and his actual capability. Another pause. Your case notes from your time in the K-9 unit downrange, the rehabilitation files, are the most complete documentation we've seen of the methodology Grayson was violating. She sat very still. The veterinary records came back an hour ago, Stokes said. T-47's last documented full examination was 7 months ago. The notes indicate a dog in early-stage recovery from handler loss trauma. The notes after that are sparse, incomplete, and the injury notation on his shoulder, the one that healed badly, isn't in the record at all. It should be, Emily said. That injury is at least 5 months old. The scar tissue tells you the healing timeline. We know. His voice didn't change. There's one more thing. The operational assessment Grayson filed that recommended euthanasia review, the one that flagged T-47 as permanently unfit. It was filed the same week Kowalski's welfare complaint was received and closed without action. She looked at Rex. He was lying with his head on his paws, watching her face in the low light. Miss Carter, Stokes's voice was careful but not unkind. I'm going to need you available tomorrow morning. There will be a formal interview on record. After that, there are decisions to be made about the program, about T-47's status, and about Colonel Grayson. I'll be there. One more thing. He paused. Captain Delgado has requested that you be reinstated to T-47's care pending the investigation conclusion. I've approved it. She let out a breath. Thank you. No, Stokes said. Ms. Carter, the device your hospital has on file under close call, averted. If T-47 hadn't located it, we'd be having a different conversation right now. Probably not with you. A pause. Get some sleep. The call ended. She looked at Rex for a long moment. Tomorrow. Everything that had been building. The timeline, the falsified records, the buried complaint, the operational assessment filed as a weapon. It was all going to come into formal light tomorrow, and whatever came after it was going to be decided by people with the authority to decide it. She should go home. She should sleep. She had a 0800 interview with the IG and everything that followed, and she needed to be clear for it. She stood up, scratched Rex behind the ear in the specific spot she'd found in week 2 that made his eyes go soft, told Torres she was going, and walked toward the parking lot. She was halfway across when her phone buzzed. A text from an internal hospital number she didn't recognize. No name. 3 sentences. Grayson requested his legal officer tonight. He's filing a countersuit against you personally. Negligence, unauthorized animal handling, emotional distress to program personnel. The filing goes in tomorrow at 700. She stood in the middle of the empty parking lot and stared at the message. An hour before her IG interview. Time to arrive in the system while she was sitting across from Stokes, carrying the weight of a personal lawsuit. She looked back toward the annex, toward the light in the crate area where Torres was still sitting, toward the place where Rex was settled in for the night. She looked at the message again. And then she did something she hadn't done in 2 weeks of this. She laughed. Not a happy sound, not a relieved sound, but the short involuntary exhale of someone who recognizes a move they've seen before and understands exactly what it means. He was scared. Grayson was scared, and scared men with resources don't fold quietly, they escalate, and the escalation told her precisely how much the morning's interview threatened him. She put the phone in her pocket and kept walking. She had 6 hours until 700. She dealt with worse odds on less sleep, in places with considerably higher stakes. And whatever Grayson filed in the morning, the IG was going to have her full statement on record first, and her service file, and Rex's veterinary records, and 11 months of Kowalski waiting on the other end of a line nobody had picked up yet. She got in her car. She drove home. But when she was 3 blocks from her apartment, her phone buzzed again. And this time it was Torres, and the message was 2 words and a question mark that stopped her cold at a red light. Rex is gone? She turned the car around before the light changed. Torres's message sat on the screen with that question mark at the end of it, and she called him before she'd made it half a block. He picked up on the first ring. "Talk to me," she said. "I stepped out to the bathroom." His voice was tight, embarrassed in the way people get embarrassed when something bad happens on their watch. 20 minutes, maybe 25. I came back and the crate was open, and he's not in the annex. He's not in the lot. I've checked the perimeter. I've got Specialist Dunham checking the east side. Did you look at the transport vehicle? A pause. It's gone. She pressed the accelerator. Call Delgado. Right now. Don't call anyone else. Just Delgado. Carter? Call him. She ended the call and drove. The garrison's secondary vehicle gate was 3 blocks north of the hospital's main entrance, the one used for equipment transfers and overnight logistics. She knew it from the program's first week, when she'd watched a supply convoy come through and noted it the way she noted exit routes and entry points. Not consciously, just as information her brain filed because 7 years of operational environments had made that a reflex. She went there now because it was the logical exit point for a military vehicle moving fast without wanting to move through the main entrance, where the security office cameras had a direct line of sight. She got there in 4 minutes, and the gate was closed, and there was no transport vehicle and no one at the guard station, which was wrong. There should have been someone at the guard station regardless of the hour. She pulled over, called Torres again. "Delgado's not answering," Torres said. "I'm trying his cell." "Where's Okafor?" "Off duty. I don't have her number." "Get it." She looked at the closed gate and thought about what moving Rex accomplished. As a material witness in an active IG investigation, removing him from the facility was obstruction. Grayson, or someone acting for him, had made a decision in the last 40 minutes that crossed from internal misconduct into something federal investigators would classify differently. Either he didn't understand that yet, or he understood it and had calculated that what Rex's presence preserved, what evidence Rex's examination might yield, was a greater threat than the risk of an obstruction charge. That told her something specific about how bad the veterinary records were. Her phone rang. Stokes. "Ms. Carter." No preamble. "I'm told T-47 is missing from the annex." "I'm at the secondary vehicle gate. It was unmanned. Transport vehicle is gone." "We're tracking the vehicle's garrison transponder. It's on Route 9 heading north." A pause, the sound of someone giving a quiet order to someone else. "Stay where you are." "Sir, if the dog is in transit without adequate environmental control, his stress response under transport, I understand. Stay where you are." She stayed where she was. She turned off the car and sat in the dark with the phone in her hand and thought about Rex in a transport crate in the back of a moving vehicle and what his body was doing, and whether Torres had managed to feed him dinner before stepping away, and whether any of this was fixable if it went wrong in the next hour. She thought about a dog with 400 operational hours whose entire record for the last 8 months had been managed toward a conclusion someone needed him to reach. She thought about what Grayson was trying to get rid of. The garrison transponder led Stokes's team to a veterinary facility 22 minutes north of Blackstone City, a private contractor, not a base facility, the kind of arrangement that existed in the gray space between military outsourcing and things that didn't appear in standard procurement records. Emily wasn't there when they arrived. Stokes had been explicit about that, but Torres called her at 2247 from the facility parking lot, voice low and tight. "They found him," Torres said. "He's okay. He's in a holding kennel. Nothing had happened yet. The vet on duty said she'd been told it was an emergency euthanasia order, behavioral emergency, immediate authorization." Emily sat with that for a moment. "She hadn't started," Torres said again, like he needed her to hear it. "Who signed the order?" "That's the thing." Torres paused. "It's got Grayson's name on it, but Rourke's here now, and he's saying the signature doesn't clear the authorization chain. There are 2 additional sign-offs required for an emergency euthanasia order on a military working dog. Neither of them signed. Meaning Grayson forged the approvals. Or had someone forged them. They're pulling the originating fax log." Torres's voice dropped further. "Carter, The vet here, Dr. Yuen, she said this is the third time a dog from the Blackstone Garrison program has come through here on an emergency order in 18 months. The other two? She completed them. She didn't know. The other two. She closed her eyes. Get Rex's transport paperwork, she said. Everything. Intake form, the order, the vehicle log, whatever Rourke can pull. Get it all. Already happening. And Torres. She paused. Tell Dr. Yuen she needs to give a statement. Rourke's already with her. After she hung up, she sat in the dark for a long time. 2 dogs. Before Rex, 2 dogs had made it to that facility and not come back. And nobody had looked at the path that led there because the paperwork said what it needed to say, and the authorization chain, falsified, she now understood, had made the orders look clean. An operational assessment, a behavioral flag, an emergency order. 3 documents. That was all it took to disappear an animal that knew something, or more accurately, an animal whose physical condition knew something, whose body carried evidence that couldn't be expunged from a record system. She thought about Rex's shoulder scar, the injury that wasn't in his medical file, the one whose tissue told a healing timeline that contradicted the documented training logs. She thought about what a forensic veterinary examination would find in a living dog that it couldn't find in one that had been euthanized. Grayson hadn't just been managing Rex's behavioral record. He'd been managing physical evidence of what Rex's body had been through. At 6:15 the next morning, Emily walked into the IG's regional office 14 minutes before her scheduled interview. With 3 hours of fractured sleep and a coffee, she was holding more for warmth than for the caffeine. The lobby had the institutional quiet of government buildings before business hours. Fluorescent lights, linoleum floors, a reception desk staffed by a young soldier who checked her ID and told her to take a seat. Stokes came out to get her himself, which she hadn't expected. He was taller than she'd pictured from the phone call, mid-60s, the physical build of a man who had once been in good shape and still mostly was, with the careful eyes of someone who had spent decades reading rooms. He shook her hand with the matter-of-fact grip of a person who'd stopped performing authority because they didn't need to. T-47 is at the base veterinary facility, he said, walking her through the corridor. Examined by our forensic vet this morning at 0500. The results are significant. The shoulder injury. Among other things. He pushed open the conference room door. The examination documented 4 separate healed injuries, none of which appear in T-47's official medical record. 2 are consistent with impact trauma. 1 is consistent with restraint injury from extended inappropriate confinement. The shoulder scar is consistent with a laceration that received inadequate treatment and was allowed to heal without veterinary intervention. She sat down. There are also markers in his coat condition and body weight trajectory consistent with periods of deliberate caloric restriction. Stokes sat across from her. Taken together, the forensic report gives us a documented pattern over approximately 14 months. 14 months. Rex's handler had died in a training accident in a Ford environment 16 months ago. 2 months of chaos, 3 transfers, and then Grayson's program, and 14 months of documented, deliberate harm. He used Rex's trauma to justify the behavioral flags, Emily said, kept him destabilized, ensured the recovery never happened so the flags stayed active. Yes. And when I started getting results, the results were a threat to the justification. Stokes looked at the file in front of him. We now have, between Kowalski's statement, the veterinary examination, the falsified euthanasia orders, and the movement of T-47 last night, a pattern that extends significantly beyond what we were initially investigating. What were you initially investigating? A pause. Training log falsification and misallocation of program funds. We had Kowalski's complaint and financial irregularities in the K-9 program budget going back 20 months. That was the scope of the original file. He looked up at her. Last night expanded it considerably. She thought about Grayson's countersuit, filed at 0700. He's suing me. We're aware. His legal officer filed at 00702. Stokes's expression didn't change. Whatever that suit claims, the evidence chain we've built in the last 18 hours is, the word I'd use is comprehensive. His legal team will have it in front of them by this afternoon. And the lawsuit? That's between you and your attorney. But I'll tell you this, the IG's findings become public record at the conclusion of the investigation. Whatever his lawsuit claims about your conduct will need to survive contact with those findings. He set the file down. Let's start your statement. The interview ran 3 hours. She gave it the same way she'd given everything. Sequential, precise, clinical, where precision was warranted, and observational where it wasn't. She described Rex's physical presentation in the first week, the specifics of what the shoulder scar indicated in terms of healing trajectory and neglect timeline. She described Grayson's behavioral patterns during the program, the parking lot demonstration, the restriction order, the office confrontation. She described what it looked like when a handler reintroduced aversive pressure to an animal that had begun stress recovery, the specific behavioral regression markers she'd observed in Rex after the restriction was imposed. Rourke was there for all of it, and Stokes for most of it, and at some point a woman Emily didn't know came in and sat quietly in the corner and took her own notes in addition to the recording, and Emily noted it but didn't ask. At 09:47, Stokes set down his pen and said, "One more question, and it's not for the formal record." Emily looked at him. "When you walked out to that parking lot and found the transport vehicle, when you decided to go to T-47's crate without authorization, did you know what you were walking into?" She thought about the honest answer. "I knew the building had patients who couldn't be evacuated. I knew the certified teams had failed. I knew Rex had 400 hours of detection work in his muscle memory." She paused. "I didn't know what Grayson was doing or why. I just knew the dog could do the job if someone gave him the right conditions. That's all? That's all I needed." Stokes looked at her for a moment. "You could have disclosed your service record at the beginning of the program. It would have changed your standing considerably." "Yes? Why didn't you?" She thought about Morrison, be the thing that doesn't change. She thought about the parking lot and Grayson's handshake and the 8 soldiers laughing at a woman sitting on concrete next to a dog's crate. "Because I wanted to be useful," she said, "not impressive." She was in the corridor at 10:23, eating a vending machine sandwich that tasted like the cellophane it came in, when Okafor appeared from the stairwell end of the hallway. Off-duty clothes, no uniform, the look of someone who'd been up for a while. She stopped when she saw Emily, and they looked at each other for a moment. "I heard about last night," Okafor said. "Yeah." Okafor leaned against the wall. "I gave my statement this morning, early." She paused. "I told them about the elevator lobby, exactly what happened." "Thank you." "I should have said something sooner, after the sweep." She looked at her hands. "When Grayson filed the restriction notification, I knew something was off. I'd seen the dog work. I'd been there." She shook her head. "I didn't say anything because Grayson was the commanding officer of the program, and I was under his authority." Emily looked at her. "You said it now. Doesn't make me feel much better about the timeline." "It's enough," Emily said. "What you saw in that lobby, it's documented now. That's what matters." Okafor was quiet for a moment. "The countersuit. Are you getting a lawyer?" "Working on it. Delgado knows a JAG officer who does civilian cases. If you want the contact." "Yeah," Emily said. "I want it. What?" The formal findings of the IG investigation were issued 17 days later, and by then most of the structural damage to Grayson's position had already occurred in the incremental way that institutional collapses tend to happen. Not all at once, but in a sequence of individual moments that each seemed manageable until they accumulated into something that wasn't. The garrison commander requested Grayson's voluntary recusal from all active program oversight on day 4, pending the investigation. Grayson declined. On day 6, the recusal became involuntary. On day 9, his access credentials to the program's administrative systems were suspended while investigators pulled 18 months of training documentation. On day 11, the falsified euthanasia authorization was formally referred to the military justice system. Emily knew these things the way she knew most things during this period, secondhand through Torres and Okafor, and one careful conversation with Delgado, who seemed to be making a considered decision about what to share and with whom. She wasn't in the investigation loop. She wasn't supposed to be. She went back to her shifts at Summit Regional, took patients' blood pressure and changed IV lines, and had the particular experience of being in the same building where all of this had started. Walking past the parking lot annex that was now empty of transport vehicles and garrison personnel, the K-9 Recovery Integration Program suspended pending review. She checked on Rex twice a day. He was in the base veterinary facility under the care of the forensic vet. Dr. Ewan had recused herself, which Emily thought showed good judgment, and the reports she got from Torres were incremental and specific in the way she liked. Eating well, weight stabilizing, the shoulder area responding to proper treatment, behavioral assessments showing consistent improvement. She didn't go to the facility. She wanted to, with an intensity that surprised her slightly, but she understood that Rex needed consistent handling from the veterinary staff right now, and her presence would introduce a variable that complicated the documentation of his recovery. So she stayed away and got the reports and thought about amber eyes and 400 operational hours. On day 14, Grayson's countersuit against her was withdrawn. She found out through a text from the JAG contact Delgado had provided, a brief professional message that said the filing had been retracted by the opposing counsel that morning, and that in the officer's opinion, the withdrawal was driven by the evidentiary direction of the IG findings rather than any change of heart. She read the message twice and felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't entirely acknowledged as held tight. She texted back, "Thank you." She put the phone in her pocket and went back to work. The formal findings landed on a Tuesday morning. She was at the nursing station charting when Stokes called. She stepped into an empty exam room and sat on the edge of the examination table and listened. The findings ran to 64 pages, Stokes told her. He gave her the summary. Falsification of training records across 14 months. Misallocation of program funds totaling over $90,000. Falsification of veterinary documentation for 3 military working dogs, including T-47. 2 confirmed unauthorized euthanasia orders with forged approvals. Deliberate interference with the welfare of a military working dog under care, sustained over a period consistent with the program's operation. Obstruction of an official investigation. The transport of T-47 on the evening of the interview constituted the formal obstruction charge, the 2 dogs who had been euthanized. She'd known it was coming, had known since Torres's call from the private facility, but hearing it in Stokes's measured voice in a clean clinical exam room made it land differently than the abstract knowledge had. "What happens to him?" she said. Stokes knew she wasn't asking about Rex. The military justice process is separate from the IG findings. I can't speak to the outcome there. What I can tell you is that the IG findings have been shared with the garrison commander and with regional command, and that Grayson has been formally suspended from duty pending the justice process. A pause. His career is over. Whatever the tribunal decides, that part is done. She sat with that. It didn't feel like satisfaction exactly. It felt like the right thing coming to rest in the right place, which was sometimes quieter than you expected. T-47's record is being formally amended, Stokes said. The behavioral flag, the operational assessment, the euthanasia recommendation, they're all being expunged and replaced with the forensic vet's examination findings and a revised operational assessment. That assessment, based on his performance during the bomb threat and the forensic evaluation, rates him as operationally capable pending completion of appropriate rehabilitation. Who conducts the rehabilitation? That decision is above my office. The program director will work with the garrison commander on placement. A pause. Your name has been raised in that conversation. She looked at the exam room wall. What did they say? I think you should talk to Dr. Vasquez, Stokes said. Gok. Vasquez called that afternoon from her office, and the conversation was 15 minutes long and direct in the way all of Vasquez's conversations were direct. She told Emily that the K-9 Recovery Integration Program was being restructured, the joint program model was being reviewed, the protocols rewritten, the oversight chain reconfigured to address the gaps the investigation had exposed. In the interim, T-47's rehabilitation had been formally assigned to Summit Regional's Animal Therapy Unit, with Emily designated as lead. You're going to need handler supervision from a certified military liaison, Vasquez said. Torres has volunteered. The garrison commander has approved his temporary attachment. Torres works, Emily said. There's something else. Vasquez paused. Not hesitation, more the pause of someone choosing the precise words. The garrison is initiating a formal rehabilitation protocol review. They want a methodology document. Written standards for K-9 trauma recovery that can be applied program-wide. Another pause. They've asked if you'd be willing to develop it. Emily sat down on the bench outside the hospital entrance where she'd taken the call, in the cold, looking at the parking lot where all of this had started. That's a significant project. Yes. It would take time. Yes. I'm still a nurse, Emily said. I'm not a program director or a protocol writer. No, Vasquez said. But you're the person who looked at a dog everyone else had written off and saw what he was actually capable of. The people asking for this document understand that. She paused again. You don't have to decide today. Emily looked at the annex door, propped open with its cinder block even now, even with the program suspended, the way it had always been propped. She thought about Torres's incident log. She thought about Kowalski, 11 months waiting for someone to pick up the other end, and the 2 dogs who'd run out of time before anyone did. She thought about the methodology document and what it would mean if it existed. Not for one program, not for one garrison, but as a written standard that could be cited and enforced and pointed to the next time someone tried to declare a capable animal unfit because it was inconvenient for them to be otherwise. I'll decide today, Emily said. Yes. Rex came back to the annex on a Thursday morning 3 weeks after the investigation concluded. Torres brought him in the base veterinary transport, which was different from the garrison transport. Smaller, better ventilated, with a crate design that didn't require loading from above. Emily was already in the annex when they pulled up, sitting on the concrete floor in the same spot she'd sat in from the beginning, hands on her knees, waiting. She heard Torres's voice outside, heard the vehicle door, heard the particular sound of a dog moving in a crate, and she sat still and waited. Torres came around the partition with Rex on a lead. A new one, softer, the kind the veterinary team had been using for the last 3 weeks, and that Rex had accepted without the reactive tension the garrison lead had always triggered. Rex came through the annex entrance and stopped, reading the space, and then he found her on the floor, and his ears came up and his body changed in the way she'd watched it change incrementally over the last 2 months. The controlled voltage unwinding, the braced readiness converting into something easier. He walked to her. She didn't get up, didn't hold out her hand, just let him come. He put his head in her lap with the full deliberate weight of an animal who has decided something. Torres stood off to the side, looking at the ceiling in the way men look at ceilings when they're preventing a particular kind of expression from appearing on their face. Hey, Emily said, which was what she always said. She put her hand on the back of Rex's neck and felt him breathing, and thought about everything that had happened since the last time she'd sat on this floor and about everything still to do. There was a long way to go. The methodology document was 2 months of work at minimum. Rex's rehabilitation had benchmarks to hit before any operational evaluation could be discussed. The garrison restructuring was ongoing and would be ongoing for a while. And there were still people in that structure who weren't entirely sure what to make of a nurse who'd walked into an active situation without authorization and turned out to be right. That ambivalence didn't disappear because an investigation concluded. But right now, in this specific moment, Rex was here and breathing and eating, and his shoulder was healing, and his eyes had a quality in them that hadn't been there when she'd first found him in this crate. She thought about Stokes on the phone. Whatever conclusions you've drawn, they need to come from the evidence chain. The evidence chain. 64 pages, 14 months, $90,000. 3 dogs, 2 of whom hadn't made it to the other side of it. It didn't resolve cleanly. It didn't come with edges. 2 animals were still dead, and Grayson's tribunal was still pending, and the protocol gap that had allowed all of it to happen didn't close just because one investigation had run its course. She knew that. She'd always known that this was the part that didn't get to feel finished, the part you carried forward because that was the only responsible thing to do with it. She scratched behind Rex's ear in the specific spot that made his eyes go soft, and he made a sound she hadn't heard from him before. Low, brief, not quite contentment, but close. The sound of an animal whose body has been running at emergency speed for a very long time and has found a moment to stop. She was still thinking about the methodology document when Torres cleared his throat. "The garrison commander wants to meet with you," he said. "Formal meeting. Tomorrow, 1400. "What for?" "He didn't say specifically." Torres paused. "But he's bringing Colonel Merritt and someone from the regional command." She looked up from Rex. "Carter." Torres's voice had something in it she couldn't quite read. "Delgado was in the meeting where they decided to call you. He said when Merritt mentioned your name, the commander didn't ask who you were." Another pause. He said, "I know who she is." She looked back down at Rex. She thought about what it meant that a garrison commander in a formal meeting had said, without hesitation, "I know who she is." She thought about what tomorrow's meeting was going to be about. And she thought about the fact that she had prepared, without entirely knowing she was preparing, for exactly this moment, not by trying to be impressive, not by filing the right forms or saying the right things to the right people, but by sitting on concrete floors in the cold and doing the work that needed doing, and letting the record build itself out of what was actually true. Tomorrow was going to be different from every other day in this building. She was certain of that now. What she didn't know yet was that when she walked into that meeting room at 1400, there was going to be a third person at the table she hadn't been told about. Someone whose presence was going to change the scope of everything she'd just agreed to by more than she was prepared for. The third person at the table was a woman named Brigadier General Patricia Holloway, and Emily recognized her the way you recognize someone you've studied without knowing you were studying them. The name from a regional command memo she'd read during her cross-attachment, a decision on K-9 welfare protocols that had never made it past draft stage, a signature on a recommendation letter that Sergeant Kowalski had mentioned once in Torres's account of the welfare complaint chain. Holloway was 60 or close to it, with the kind of face that had stopped performing anything a long time ago. She watched Emily come through the door and didn't say anything immediately, just looked at her with the assessment of someone who had already done their reading. The garrison commander, Brigadier General Thomas Aldridge, whose name Emily had known from the program paperwork, but whose face she was seeing for the first time, stood when she entered, which she hadn't expected. Merritt was beside him. Torres was in the corridor and had told her he'd wait, and she'd told him that was fine, and now she was in this room with 3 general officers and a chair waiting for her at the table, and the particular quality of silence that meant everyone had been talking before she arrived and had stopped specifically because she had. "Ms. Carter," Aldridge gestured to the chair. "Thank you for coming." She sat down. She put her hands on the table because she'd learned a long time ago that hands in your lap looked like someone waiting to leave. "You've read the IG findings," Aldridge said. It wasn't a question. "The summary?" "Yes." "Then you know where we are with Colonel Grayson." "I know where the investigation is. I don't know where the tribunal is." "The tribunal convenes in 3 weeks." Aldridge looked at the file in front of him, then back at her. "Based on the charges referred, the falsified euthanasia orders alone constitute conduct unbecoming an officer in the most formal sense. The financial irregularities, the training log falsification, the obstruction." He paused. "He will be discharged. The specific grade at which that happens is what the tribunal determines. But the career is finished." She nodded once. "There's something the IG findings don't include," Holloway said. It was the first time she'd spoken, and her voice was the kind that didn't need volume to carry. "Because it falls outside the investigation's formal scope. Sergeant Kowalski." Emily looked at her. "He was transferred overseas on a rotation that Grayson personally requested," Holloway said. "We can't add that to the current charges because the rotation itself was procedurally clean. He used the right forms, the right channels. But what it represents, combined with everything else, is a pattern of active suppression." She set her hands on the table. "Kowalski has been offered reassignment back to Blackstone Garrison if he wants it. He's considering." The room was quiet for a moment. "Ms. Carter," Merritt said, "we asked you here today for 2 reasons. The first is to formally apologize on behalf of this command for the conditions you were subjected to during the program, the restriction order, the countersuit, the manner in which your expertise and your service record were dismissed." She didn't phrase it as anything other than what it was, didn't dress it in institutional language. "That was wrong. It caused direct harm to you and to T-47, and it should not have happened." Emily looked at Merritt. She'd thought about this moment. Not specifically, not with any particular script attached to it, but she'd known something like it was coming and had tried to figure out in advance what she'd feel when it did. She'd expected more. More resolution, more of the emotional weight lifting. What she actually felt was quieter than that, more like the last line of a long equation resolving into something simple and correct. "Thank you," she said. "The second reason," Aldridge said, "is an offer." "What?" "The offer was this. A newly created position, Director of K-9 Rehabilitation Standards, housed jointly between the Regional Military Command and the VA medical system under a partnership that Holloway had been trying to establish for 3 years and had finally gotten the authorization for. The role involved completing the methodology document she'd already agreed to develop, then extending it. A full rehabilitation protocol for military working dogs recovering from operational trauma, deployable across garrison programs nationally. It involved training. It involved oversight authority. It involved a staff of 4, including Torres if he agreed to a formal reassignment, and an embedded veterinary liaison from the base animal facility. It was not a nursing position. It was not a position Emily had a title for exactly in any conventional sense. It sat in the space between clinical work and policy work and operational expertise, which was precisely the space her actual background occupied. The background that had been sitting behind the civilian summary on her hire form for 2 years while she took blood pressure readings and changed IV lines and did the job in front of her because that was what you did. Holloway watched her process it. "It's not a glamorous office," she said. "The first year will be mostly documentation and probably more meetings than you'll want. The training program won't be fully operational for at least 18 months. And T-47, Emily said. "Remains in your program," Aldridge said. "His rehabilitation is the proof of concept. His operational reassessment at the end of the protocol is the first formal test of whether what you're building actually works." She thought about what she'd told Vasquez. Yes. She thought about the methodology document and what it would mean as a written standard that couldn't be expunged from a record system the way Rex's injuries had been. She thought about what it meant that this offer existed at all. That Holloway had been trying to establish this partnership for 3 years and had the authorization now, specifically now, in the aftermath of an investigation that had made visible what happened when no such standard existed. 2 dogs were still dead. That fact didn't change because this room existed. It sat in her the way certain things sit, not resolved, not forgiven, just carried, because that's the honest response to something that can't be undone. "Yes," she said, for the second time in a week, to a question she hadn't seen coming. Aldridge nodded. Merritt made a note. Holloway looked at Emily for a moment with something in her expression that wasn't quite relief, but was adjacent to it. "There's one more thing," Holloway said. "The formal record amendment for T-47, the expungement of the behavioral flag and the operational assessment, will be issued publicly. The Garrison's Public Affairs Office will be releasing a statement." "Publicly," Emily said. "The program was established under a public partnership with Summit Regional. The suspension was reported. The investigation was reported." Holloway looked at her evenly. "The correction needs to be reported too. That's how this works if it's going to mean anything." Emily thought about Grayson and the parking lot and 8 soldiers laughing at a woman on a concrete floor. She thought about this way an institution handled this kind of thing, when it was doing it correctly, not quietly, not with the minimum necessary disclosure, but in the open, where the record was visible to the same people who'd watched the original error happen. "Agreed," she said. Grayson's tribunal convened on a gray Tuesday morning 22 days later, in a room Emily was not present for and did not need to be present for. She knew this the way she'd known a lot of things during this process, not from direct observation, but from the accumulated evidence of what was real, and the patience to let the real thing take its shape. She was in the annex with Rex when Torres got the notification. He came around the partition with his phone, and she looked at his face and knew before he said anything. "Reduction in grade," he said. "Forfeiture of retirement pay above the reduced rate. Discharge." He looked at the phone. "Conduct unbecoming. Obstruction. 2 counts of falsification of official military records." He scrolled. The financial charges are being referred to a separate civilian proceeding. She sat with Rex's lead in her hand. They'd been working on controlled exposure to the corridor, a small step in the long process of building the environmental tolerance he'd need for operational work, and she felt the information land without the drama she'd half expected from herself. What she felt was not triumph. She'd been honest enough with herself in the preceding weeks to know that triumph wasn't the right container for it. Grayson had hurt animals who couldn't report what was being done to them and people who could report it and hadn't been believed, and the system that was supposed to catch that had not caught it for 14 months. The tribunal's outcome was correct. It was also insufficient in the way all correct institutional responses to preventable harm are insufficient because they happen after. What mattered was the after. What came next? Because there was always a next, and the question was always whether the next was better built than what preceded it. "Okay," she said. Torres looked at her. "That's it? What do you want me to say?" He thought about it. "I don't know. Something." "He's gone," she said. "Rex is here. We have work to do." Torres pocketed his phone and picked up the training log they'd been maintaining, and they went back to work. What? The public affairs statement went out that afternoon, and the response to it was something Emily hadn't prepared for. Not because she should have known it was coming, but because there's a particular texture to being seen after a long period of being deliberately not seen, and it's different from anything you can anticipate in advance. The hospital's social media team sent her a message that evening. The statement had been shared widely. Comments were, "She didn't have the right word." She read a few of them and set her phone down and didn't read more, not because they weren't kind, but because she didn't know what to do with that much directed human attention and had never been good at it. Vasquez called. "How are you doing with all of this?" "I'm fine." "Emily," Vasquez's voice had a quality in it. "That's not what I asked." She sat down on the bench outside the hospital, where she'd taken too many important phone calls in the cold to count. "It's strange," she said, "to have people know your name for something other than the thing you were just doing. You're going to have to get used to it." "I know." She paused. "I don't think I will." Vasquez made a sound that might have been a laugh. "I know. That's why you're good at what you do." A pause. "The nursing staff here, some of them want to do something. A small thing. Can I tell them yes?" Emily thought about small things. "Yeah," she said. "You can tell them yes." The small thing turned out to be not small. She walked into the break room on her last official shift as Summit Regional's ER nurse. She'd given notice the week after the meeting, the transition to the new role requiring full-time commitment, and found 17 people standing in a room that wasn't designed for 17 people, with a cake that someone had clearly put effort into and a handwritten card that was already slightly tear-stained before she touched it because the person who'd written it had apparently done so under emotional conditions. She was not a person who handled being seen easily, as Vasquez had correctly identified. She stood in the door for a moment and looked at the faces of people she'd worked beside for 2 years. The charge nurse who'd told her they're here on the first morning of the program. The residents who'd watched her in action and learned things she hadn't known she was teaching. The overnight security guard who brought coffee to the nursing station without being asked and was here now, in the wrong shift, because someone had texted him. "I wasn't trying to do anything dramatic," she said, because she had to say something. The charge nurse said, "You sat on a concrete floor in the cold for 2 weeks talking to a dog everyone else was afraid of. That's fairly dramatic." Someone laughed. The tension in the room shifted, and then it was just people in a break room with a cake that was slightly lopsided, and she thought about 2 years of doing the work in front of her and what it had accumulated into, and she thought that whatever came next, she was taking all of this with her, the blood draws and the medication consults, and the charge nurse's voice through a supply room door, and the particular quality of doing ordinary work with consistent care and trusting that the consistency was enough. She ate the cake. She read the card. She didn't cry in the break room, which she counted as a personal achievement, but she came close enough that it was a near thing. Fact. Rex's formal operational reassessment was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in late spring, 4 months after the methodology document had been submitted to regional command and accepted without revision, which was unusual enough that Holloway had mentioned it specifically in the acceptance letter. The reassessment wasn't a single event. It was a series of structured evaluations conducted by a panel that included the forensic vet, a certified operational handler from a unit that had no prior connection to the Blackstone Garrison program, and a behavioral specialist from the VA's Animal Therapy Division. Emily was present as the supervising rehabilitation lead, but was explicitly not part of the evaluation panel, which was the right call. She was too close to it, had always been too close to it, and the integrity of the assessment required eyes that hadn't watched Rex eat his first full meal since his handler died, or take his first voluntary step toward a stranger. The evaluation ran 4 hours. She waited in the corridor with Torres, who was unusually quiet in the way he got quiet when he was running calculations he didn't want to speak yet. She drank bad hallway coffee and read through the training logs on her tablet without really reading them, and watched the clock move in the way clocks move when you've decided not to watch them. At the 2-hour mark, one of the panel members came out of the evaluation room for a water break, and Emily watched his face for information and found nothing useful, which she took as neither good nor bad. At the 3.5-hour mark, Torres said, "Whatever happens, don't," she said. "I was just going to say, I know what you were going to say. Don't." He went back to his phone. She went back to the training logs. The door opened at 11:47. The behavioral specialist came out first, and she had the look of someone who had just watched something that exceeded their professional expectations. And she didn't say anything to Emily directly, just gave her a nod that communicated more than a sentence would have. The certified handler was behind her, and he stopped in the corridor and looked at Emily for a moment. "Where did you do your K9 training?" he asked. "Forward surgical unit, cross-attached to a K9 team." He considered that. "Which deployment?" She told him. He nodded slowly, the nod of someone filing information into the correct context. "The methodology document, I've read it. The section on graduated environmental exposure." He paused. "It's the best thing I've read on the subject in 10 years. She didn't know what to say to that, so she said, "Thank you." The forensic vet was last out of the room, and she had Rex with her on his lead, the soft one, the one he'd accepted. And Rex came through the door into the corridor and found Emily immediately, the way he always found her, and walked to her and pressed against her left leg with the familiar deliberate weight. The forensic vet handed her a single page. The formal assessment summary. T-47 Rex, operational status, cleared. Recommended for full active duty, return pending handler placement. Behavioral presentation consistent with recovered trauma response. Detection accuracy during evaluation, 100% across 6 concealed material placements. She read it once. She looked at Rex. He was watching her face the way he always watched her face when she was reading something, with the patient attention of an animal who has learned that human faces carry information worth monitoring. "You did it," she told him. He wagged his tail once, which was not a thing he did often. It was brief and unselfconscious, and it undid something in her chest completely. Torres was looking at the ceiling again. The ceremony was Holloway's idea, and it was smaller than Emily had expected given everything that had preceded it, which was why she agreed to it. A conference room at the regional command building, 40 people roughly. The garrison unit that had been in the parking lot on the first morning of the program, not all of them, but a significant portion. Plus Merritt, Delgado, Okafor, Torres, Vasquez, Rourke, and a few faces from the IG office. Dr. Ewan from the private veterinary facility, who had driven 90 minutes and whose presence Emily hadn't expected and was glad of. Kowalski was there. She hadn't met him before today, had only known him as a name in a chain of events, a sergeant who'd filed a complaint and been sent away before anyone acted on it, who'd been sitting on the other end of a line for 11 months. He was younger than she'd pictured, late 20s, quiet in the specific way people get quiet after they've spent a long time not being listened to. He shook her hand and held it for a moment. "I didn't think it was going to go anywhere," he said. "The complaint. I filed it because I didn't know what else to do." "It went somewhere," she said. "Because of you." She shook her head. "Because you started it. I just came in later." He looked at her with the expression of someone calibrating that assessment against their own experience of the 11 months in between. He didn't argue with her. He also didn't fully agree, and she respected that. Holloway spoke for 7 minutes, which was the right length for something like this. She outlined the new protocol's national deployment timeline, the partnership structure between the regional command and the VA system, the training program for garrison K-9 handlers that was now incorporated into the baseline curriculum at 3 facilities. She said Emily's name with the same flatness she said everything. Not ceremonial, not inflated, just accurate. She said Rex's name too, which mattered because the ceremony was for both of them, and anything less than that would have been incomplete. Aldridge presented the formal citation. Emily took it with both hands and read it standing up, which felt like the right thing, and the room was quiet while she read it. The citation was 4 paragraphs. It used the word exemplary once, which was probably one time too many, but the substance of it was honest and specific, and she could tell that someone had taken care with the language, and she appreciated that. Then Aldridge said something that wasn't in any prepared remarks. He looked at the room and said, "I want to say something about what actually happened here, separate from the citation." He paused. This institution failed. We had a system that was supposed to protect animals in our care and personnel who identified problems within that system, and we failed both of them. The investigation, the findings, the tribunal, those are the correction, not the prevention. The prevention is what Ms. Carter built, what we're deploying now. He looked at Emily directly. The correction gets the headlines. The prevention doesn't. I want it on record that I know which one is harder. The room was quiet in a way that meant people were sitting with something. She stood up when she was supposed to stand up, said thank you in the way you say thank you when the words are both insufficient and accurate, and then sat back down and looked at her hands on the table. She thought about a parking lot and a cinder block propping open a door, and a woman walking out into the cold with her ID badge and 1 cup of coffee toward a crate with a caution marker, toward a dog who had every reason not to trust the next human who sat down in front of him. She thought about what Morrison had said. Be the thing that doesn't change. She hadn't known that first morning what any of this would cost or where it would go. She'd just known the work in front of her. She'd sat on cold concrete and waited, and come back the next day and waited, because that was what the situation required, and because she was, at her core, someone who did what the situation required regardless of who was watching or whether anyone would know. That was the part nobody could give her a citation for. The part that happened before there was anything to validate. The choosing to sit down and stay. Rex was in the corridor with Torres during the ceremony. 40 people in a conference room was not yet within his environmental tolerance. And that was fine. That was where the work still was. She went out to him after, while people were still talking inside, and she crouched down and he put his nose against her shoulder the way he'd done the first time she opened his crate, and it had meant something she hadn't wanted to name yet. She named it now. Safe. That was what she'd given him. Not a command, not a method, not a protocol. Just the consistent, patient, imperfect offering of a person who kept showing up and never made the showing up contingent on what she got back. She sat on the floor of the hallway in her good clothes, outside a ceremony being held partly in her honor, with a dog's weight against her shoulder, and she thought that this was probably the truest version of any recognition she was ever going to get. Not the citation, or the applause, or the 4 paragraphs with exemplary in them, but this. Torres appeared at the end of the corridor with 2 cups of coffee, looked at her on the floor, and handed one down without comment. Handler placement decision came in, he said, for Rex's active duty return. He sipped his coffee. Kowalski requested it. She looked up. He put in the request this morning, Torres said. Aldridge approved it an hour ago. He paused. He wants to finish what he started. She looked back at Rex, who was watching her face for information the way he always did, patient and certain. There was a rightness to that she didn't have words for that weren't too large or too small for what she was actually feeling. Kowalski, who had started the complaint because he didn't know what else to do, who had waited 11 months on the other end of a line nobody picked up, now going back to the beginning of it, back to Rex, who had been the reason for all of it, who had been the center of a system's failure and was now going to be the first proof that the correction could hold. None of it was smooth. None of it was finished. There were still garrison programs running on old protocols. There were handlers who hadn't read the methodology document and wouldn't for months. There was a civilian legal proceeding still processing the financial charges, and a tribunal record that didn't bring back 2 dogs, and an institution that had made the right moves after the fact and would need to be watched to make sure the right moves became habits rather than responses. That was the work. Not the ceremony, not the citation, not the moment in the hallway with coffee. The work was the long, undramatic, unrecognized, sustained effort of building something that lasted. She knew how to do that. She'd been doing it the whole time, in every room where nobody was watching, on every morning when showing up was the only thing she had to offer. She stood up, straightened her jacket, picked up the coffee Torres had handed her, and took a sip that tasted better than the last 100 cups she'd had in this building. Kowalski's going to need the transition plan, she said. For Rex, the environmental exposure sequence, the lead tolerance protocol, the escalation markers. Already on your desk. And the next facility review is Thursday. I moved it to Friday. You had a conflict. She looked at him. You didn't know you had a conflict, Torres said, because you don't check your calendar far enough ahead. That was true. Fine. Friday. She started walking back toward the conference room. And Torres. Yeah. Good work, she said. These last months, all of it. He was quiet for a moment, the ceiling looking kind of quiet. I just filed the incident log, he said. That's all I did. She glanced back at him. That's not all you did. He didn't argue with that either. She went back through the door. Inside, people were still talking, still holding cups, still carrying the ordinary hum of a room where something real had happened and people were trying to keep it alive a little longer in conversation. Merritt caught her eye from across the room and gave her the small nod that Merritt used instead of most other expressions. Okafor was talking to Rourke in the corner, serious-faced, the conversation of people who are thinking about the next problem. Vasquez found her near the window. How does it feel? Vasquez asked. Emily thought about it honestly. Like there's a lot left to do. Vasquez looked at her with the expression she'd had on the phone months ago, the one that said she was seeing something accurately. Yeah, she said. That's how it feels when you're the right person for a job. Emily looked out the window at the parking lot below, the one with the annex, the cinder block, the crate with the caution marker that wasn't there anymore. Just an ordinary parking lot, just a building. She thought about what it meant to do the right thing in a room where no one would notice, to sit with something broken and believe, without evidence that the effort was worth making, to be the thing that doesn't change day after day while everything else is deciding what it's going to become. She thought about every person who had ever done that and never been in a room like this one afterward, the ones who filed the complaint and got transferred, the ones who sat with the difficult thing and kept sitting and never found out what it became. She thought about them without romance, without easy resolution, just with the plain acknowledgement that they existed, that they mattered, that the work they did in the unwitnessed places was the actual foundation that everything visible was built on. The only difference between her and them, she thought, was not talent or judgment or even courage. It was that someone had finally picked up the other end. That was the thing worth building, not her methodology document, not her protocol, not her title. The conditions under which picking up the other end became possible. The system that made the next person sit on the cold floor worth something before anyone arrived to verify it. She turned away from the window. She had work to do.